Well, we're on the last reading of part 4, and so we're on the fourth section, basically. We only have 100 more pages to go. We've already gone through 300 pages, and we only have the last 100 to go. We've talked already about earlier societies, the development of writing, and things of that nature, and things that define social complexity. In this section, we're still talking about cities, pyramids, and palaces. Again, we've covered Mesopotamia, all right? And we're talking about the early states of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Aegean. And so the cities around those geographical places. We've already covered Mesopotamia. Now we're going to cover Egypt. And if we have time, we just might get to the Aegean. All right, but it's a lot to go through. So bear with me. The splendor of the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt has long evoked wonder and mystery. Some people have even been led to mystical interpretations of ancient Egypt, seeing monuments such as the pyramids at Giza as evidence of supernatural or extraterrestrial activity. However, archaeological research has uncovered very different perspectives. As scientists unearth potsherds and domestic remains, as well as tracing the processes by which monuments were constructed, a coherent picture of the intensely human aspect emerges. Ancient Egypt is not the product of otherworldly forces. The monuments that amaze us today are the result of human effort and imagination on an enormous scale, as well as the mathematics of the ancient Egyptians. And perhaps the most awesome feature of the pyramids is not their size, but rather the chisel marks left on the stones that occurred over 4,000 years ago. And so these marks open up the real mysteries of the pyramids. How were the people motivated to undertake such a venture? How were they organized? How were they fed? These questions led to the core of the issues surrounding the origin of the state. And, of course, we'll talk about the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley is a lush vegetation descending from the highlands of Ethiopia, and it stands in sharp contrast to the surrounding desert. So you can look at the Nile Valley on a map of Egypt. The Nile descends out of the highlands of Ethiopia to cut a dramatic swathe through the deserts of the Sudan and Egypt. Now, until the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s, the annual flooding of the Nile River deposited rich alluvial silts across the valley floor. The contrast between the lush vegetation of the Nile Valley and the surrounding desert is stark. One can literally place foot in agricultural fields and the other foot in desert sand. Egypt is thus an extreme case of circumscription in which the limits of inhabitable land are very cogently defined. Egypt is divided into Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. To the north of Cairo, the Nile Valley spreads into several branches, forming the Delta region as it flows toward the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, the limit of Upper Egypt is defined by a series of cataracts or rapids in the area around the modern border between Egypt and Sudan. Aside from the Nile Valley and the Delta, the major inhabitable areas in Egypt are a number of small oases in the western desert and the Fayum Depression, which is located just south of Cairo. And of course, you'll see most of the world's Egyptian artifacts you can find in the British Museum if you can't make it over to Cairo in Egypt, which showcases the largest exhibitions in Egyptology. And so we've just covered Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Again, the southern Egyptian Nile River Valley, ending in a series of cataracts or rapids in the area around the modern border between Egypt and Sudan. That is Upper Egypt. However, the northern part of the Egyptian Nile River Valley, including the Nile Delta, that would be considered Lower Egypt. A chronology. The shift toward state society in Egypt began during the pre-dynastic period, the political organization of which remains poorly understood. However, it does appear that by the late pre-dynastic period, 3 kingdoms had formed along the Nile Valley. The earliest evidence for the unification of Egypt under a single ruler is a slab of carved slate known as the Narmer palette, discovered at the site of Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt. The Narmer palette shows scenes of conquest by a king named Narmer. The rule of Narmer marks the end of the pre-dynastic period and the beginning of the early dynastic period. Significantly, on one side of the palette, Narmer is shown wearing the white conical crown of Upper Egypt, while on the other he is shown wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. The depiction of Narmer with these 2 crowns indicates that he ruled the entire Nile Valley. And again, the Narmer palette shows Narmer wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, both the white and the red. And how is the power of Narmer shown through this artifact? The chronology of Egyptian kings is known from documents and monuments. The classical historian Manetho, from around 3000 or 300 BCE, devised the system of grouping kings into dynasties. Egyptian dynastic history outlined can be divided into 3 cycles of integration and collapse. During periods of integration, for example, early dynastic / Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, Egypt was controlled by a single centralized authority. During periods of collapse, so the first intermediate period, the second intermediate period, and the third intermediate period, competing centers of authority emerged, and competing dynasties with control over only a part of the country ruled simultaneously. A constant dynamic in Egyptian dynastic history is a struggle for dominance between Upper and Lower Egypt. The first dynasty was based in Hierakonpolis and Abydos in Upper Egypt. In the second dynasty, the site of the royal cemetery shifted to Saqqara in Lower Egypt. During the Old Kingdom, however, kingship was firmly established at Memphis in Lower Egypt. In the New Kingdom, the center of power shifted to Luxor in Upper Egypt. Although Egypt was relatively well protected from foreign invasion, and incursions from the north and the south did take place, particularly during the periods of collapse. During the Middle and New Kingdoms, Egypt embarked on ambitious military campaigns in the north, ultimately coming into conflict with Mesopotamian powers. And during those same kingdoms, Egypt also came to play an active role in trade networks connecting the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean. So we're thinking about Egypt, and it's very well protected by the desert and the mountains. And so from north, south, east, west, it's protected by not just the delta, not just the desert, but most of those zones are uninhabitable, and to bring an army through those zones would be very difficult, very treacherous, and very deadly. And it would be a very challenging task to do that, and so Egypt remained in a state of prosperity for most of its history. Concerning the government, concerning writing as well, the ultimate source of the power of Egyptian king was his identification as a divinity. The king in Egypt was the human incarnation of the falcon god Horus, the paramount god in the Egyptian pantheon. Upon his death, the king became the incarnation of the god Osiris, the god of the dead. The king also had a special relationship with the sun god Ra. However, the way this relationship was expressed varies among documents. And so, of course, we have the pre-dynastic period, the early dynastic period, the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom, the second intermediate period, the New Kingdom, and then the third intermediate period. And, of course, we can see the major sites of the early dynastic period of Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Saqqara. The Old Kingdom, major sites would be Giza and Memphis, and then, of course, the New Kingdom would be Thebes and Amarna. I won't necessarily go into the dates of these periods, nor will I go into the actual dynasties that those cover, but it's about 25 dynasties. The power of the king was tightly linked to the critical Egyptian concept of Ma'at, which combines the virtues of balance and justice. In Egyptian thought, chaos and disorder were viewed as catastrophic, and the role of the king was to ensure the preservation of Ma'at, the combination of balance and justice. It was of central importance to Egyptian society. The breakdown of centralized rule during periods of collapse is described in Egyptian documents as a fundamental, even cosmic calamity. It is quite a distance from the lofty concepts of divine kingship and Ma'at to the more mundane business of organizing a large kingdom. It is clear, for example, that the divine status of the ruler did not prevent palace intrigue and in some cases even murder. The king controlled the state through the agency of armies and scribes. During the harvesting and processing of cereals, scribes intervened at every stage in order to measure output and theft. The yield of the harvest was measured in the field during transport and at delivery, and so the quantities of bread and beer produced from grain were carefully measured before being distributed as rations to the Egyptians. A painting of the role of the scribe is found on the bottom register of a scene painted in an Old Kingdom tomb from Saqqara. Egyptian tombs were often painted with detailed depictions of daily life meant to magically provide for the deceased in the afterlife. The tomb of Tai at Saqqara gives particularly detailed pictures of a bakery and a brewery. It was a bakery and a brewery, actually. In the bottom register, a line of scribes is shown at work. Scribes are depicted as an integral element of the operation of a bakery. An individual to the left of the scene is depicted as being brought to the scribes for discipline. And there is a clear sense that in ancient Egypt, the extended family remained an essential social unit. Some even go so far as to suggest that the conception of kingship was based on an extension of the household. A study of graffiti left by workers on blocks in the Giza pyramids affords a unique insight into the organization of labor in the Old Kingdom of Egypt. Workers were organized into large labor groups or units, perhaps by clan or extended family, and of course this evidence challenges the idea that the state represents a rupture with social organization based on kinship. And so we end with the scene from the tomb of Tai at Saqqara, and it shows a scribe overseeing part of the process of bread baking. And of course, it also was a brewery as well. So that's all we're going to do in this section. We're still covering Egypt in the next video. We'll talk about the development of architecture and mostly mortuary architecture, which was the function of the pyramids to act as tombs for the dead kings. Now, and we'll talk about writing in cuneiform, all right, and tracking trade routes in Egypt. And so after we talk about the pyramids, we'll talk about the state. We'll talk about Amarna and Akhenaten, King Akhenaten, and then we'll finish. And then we'll talk about Africa beyond the Nile Valley. We'll talk about, and then we'll talk about the Aegean after that. So it won't be very difficult. We'll do one more video talking about Egypt, and then we'll go into the Aegean. And we'll talk about Knossos, the site of Knossos. And we'll talk about Minoan culture and Mycenaean culture as well. The Mycenaeans took heavily from the Minoan culture. And then the Minoans were located on the island of Crete. And we've talked about that earlier, and in a different playlist. And then, of course, as we know, the Mycenaeans were a Bronze Age society, and they developed on the Peloponnese Peninsula, as well as that of Magna Graecia, or Central Greece. And so the Mycenaeans were more mainland. The Minoan society was mostly seafaring, and they lived off a diet of mostly a sea diet, because they were basically limited to what they could eat based upon their geographical location. So that ends this video, and then we'll talk about Egypt in the next one. Thanks.